Hi everyone, this is going to be a suggested edit video for this drawing of Shazam by fellow How to Draw Comics Facebook group member Vince Shadow 2. So let's just dive right in. Starting with the head, hairlines come much closer to the temples, away from the ears. And then the other big issue is symmetry. Keep an eye out for the center line of the face. Make sure the mouth is centered under the nose, and especially the chin actually is centered on the face and the features with it. So that's what I had to do for the most part, was really bring in that jaw and that side of the face. And then you're going to see I start to make further corrections soon by removing this eye onto its own layer, so I can get that one eye's width space in between the two eyes, and then adjust the height of the two eyes so they're much more level with each other across that kind of center line of the head. Another very common problem is artists tend to make the head protrude too much from the back. Heads are much more narrow than that. So I just brought that in, and then I'm going to adjust the neck accordingly to taper a bit more toward the base of the skull. And now I'm going to move on to the nose. You might consider this a stylistic choice, but in my opinion it was just too abstracted and manga-like, and the shape especially of the bottom of the nose was far too unrealistic and undetailed compared to the styling of the rest of the drawing and anatomy, which had much more detail lines and much more accurate anatomy. So I just gave him a more human bottom of the nose and nostrils, and that little divot centered above the top lip. I also made more adjustments to the eyes to make them a bit more realistic, and added a few more detail lines to better match the style of the rest of the body. And here I'm fixing the anatomy of the ear, actually creating that kind of inset area there, the kind of inside of the cone that collects the sound toward it, and just correcting that anatomy. And speaking of anatomy, there were some areas that were just, even for a stylized kind of superhero, just too bulged. So I'm just going to go around here and tame a little bit of these angles and things like the extremely protruding elbow, and just make some minor corrections that are going to bridge that gap better between the extremely realistic anatomical detailing and just the contours. Another really common issue when artists start to learn anatomy, especially for muscular superheroes, make sure you don't kind of forget that an arm is mostly a cylinder and a forearm mostly a cone. Make sure you think of it as those major shapes, and then use your knowledge of anatomy and shading to give a bit more detail and delineation of those kind of subsections. This particular illustration especially has that problem on his right forearm, which is the forearm on the left, which I'll deal with more later. But first we have to deal with the biggest problem with this illustration, which is you're not being mindful enough with the center line going vertically down the character. Especially when drawing the chest, too many beginner artists forget, and they draw the front of the chest in a very flat manner. You see where the base of the throat basically connects to the chest. That's where the chest needs to start. So you saw that I curved that top of the chest inward to meet his neck, which gives it a much more three-dimensional muscular chest look. And here I'm drawing that center line of the chest to make that more clear. And that same center line issue caused this massive problem where you've got this flap in the chest that folds over to cover the other pec, but that makes it incredibly hard for you to actually center that Shazam lightning symbol on the chest. Pay attention to that center line of the chest and ask yourself, is 50% of that symbol on the left pec and the other 50 on the right pec, or as you saw before, it was overwhelmingly on one side of his chest. And while I was fixing that, it was time to get rid of the very strange sagging fabric. You kind of shouldn't have it both ways. You can't have super skin tight painted on looking spandex, but then it's really being pushed and sagging and drooping down in the one spot near the bottom of the lightning symbol. It made it look like that lightning symbol was really rigid and was in a very weird, abnormal, and uncomfortable way stretching the spandex down toward his belt. This will allow me to put in the actual detailing of the abs and other chest anatomy and to draw that nice contrast that you could have between that sash-like belt, the wrappings on the forearm, and the really tight spandex, and of course the flowing cape. But first I'm going to make some rough shading corrections to deal with that issue I mentioned before, where you were really delineating and shading each thing as a separate thing that was barely stuck together to make a cohesive form. So I'm just trying to even out some of those, some of the shading to get a more natural, cohesive thing, and that's especially true in this forearm, but especially the forearm on the other side of the illustration. So you can see I'm shading it to be more of just a cylindrical cone type shape, and then starting to add the detailing over it. And another thing to keep in mind, if you're going to have a fabric that's wrapped around another fabric that's wrapped around an arm, show that depth not only in the kind of contour of it, but the actual line art that separates it. You could see I created this kind of broken contour shape to show that each layer of the wrapped fabric around the forearm has actual dimension, and I'm doing the same thing with the belt. You can see that I made it feel like it has dimension, and it's on top and wrapped around the spandex clad body. The other thing you'll see me doing, especially on the fabric that's wrapped around things and the belt and the cape, is simplifications. It can be tempting to really go for detail, but it really looks kind of like beginner's work when it's obvious you're putting in a lot of labor, but you don't really have a super clear idea of where you're going with it. You're just kind of filling space because you feel like it needs to be filled. So study more on how to draw capes and how to think of it just like you should think of hair in kind of bigger bundles or clumps or shapes that all flow in a direction, and then you kind of gently fill in the spaces in between those major shapes. It's going to give you much more confident looking, much more natural results. Whereas you could see like the lines in between his body and arm on the right hand side, it's these very kind of non-committal, just there to fill up space, and I'm going to be erasing that soon. But more importantly, back to this forearm, that was one of the biggest problems with the line art, was how jagged and irregular that top contour line of the fabric wrapped around his forearm was there. If you go back and look, it was just really a roller coaster ride of these super exaggerated hills and valleys of the shape of the forearm. The forearm, no matter how strong someone gets, is never that lumpy and irregular a shape. It's always mostly a kind of rounded over cone shape. And here I'm just going to start adding more specific shading and go deeper with a lot of shadows to really bring out some of the form. And you can see I'm again going for more simplified and definitive and kind of confident anatomy, so to speak, of the fabric. And in a second you're going to see I'm going to erase your signature. That's not so I can steal credit for the illustration. That's because that was not really a visually appealing place to sign your name or at such an angle. Keep it horizontal, or I guess perfectly vertical for some signature designs, and just put it somewhere kind of out of the way and not on a kind of tangent with the actual illustration angles. And here I'm about to fix another minor anatomical issue. You didn't quite give enough room in between the bottom of the pecs and the underside of the rib cage where the abdomen starts. And it's always a good idea to horizontally flip your artwork while you're working on it. Even if you're drawing on paper, you can hold it up to a mirror or up to a window so you can see through the paper and see your image reversed. Seeing your image reversed immediately removes your visual biases, and it's like you're looking at someone else's artwork, and it makes it much easier for you to see your mistakes, especially proportional, or we all tend to have some kind of bias where we make things slant in one weird direction or another, and seeing your art reversed really helps very quickly eliminate those biases and make corrections much faster. So you can see I'm trying to give a more definitive shape to this whole cape, trying to make sure there's some kind of logical flow. If you look back a while back before I erased it, there was a gold edge on the top of the back of the cape, but it was completely unclear what that was an edge of, what part of the cape had that edge up there. So I made a definitive side of the cape, and it's kind of folded over, and you see that edge there. And now I'm re-emphasizing specific, confident, definitive anatomy for the shape of the cape by darkening the shadows and leaving some highlight. And then I'm going to go back in later and put some very specific, bold line work, and just going to make minor corrections as I go. But that's how you do it. You put it in, you get a feel for it, and then you figure out what kind of corrections you need to make, and then you go from there. So now we're getting closer to the end of my rough suggested edits, so I just want to put in some bold and clear line art and make final corrections, trying to get that symbol even more centered on the chest, trying to make clear delineations for the contour of the body. I'll flip it back in the original direction it was facing. As you can see, I'm just adding more clear shadows and line art and just trying to clean things up just enough so that when I'm done with the final suggested edits, you can have a easier time judging if my suggested edits actually are an improvement or not. But before I wrap things up, especially for a cool superhero character floating in space, one really nice illustration technique is to give edge or rim lighting. So I just pick a very bright color on another layer that I set to a mode like screen, and I just hit the very edges, but not the black line, just the inside of the black line art with one highlight color, and then I create a more blue or purple reflected light color and hit the opposite side. So that's really pretty much it for my suggested edits. Here is the original, and now I've cross-faded to the edited version. I hope you can see how the figure looks more three-dimensional and cohesive. And of course, corrections were made to centering the thing. That was the biggest theme, I would say, is center line. Pay attention to the center line going down the figure and always think in three-dimensional form. And that's going to be it for this one. Thanks very much for watching. Stay tuned for more videos, and if you liked this and thought it was useful, please do like and subscribe.